Don't worry, it's absolutely in there. All right, should we recommence? Well, first of all, we'll have a good lunch. Good food and still lots of engaged conversation going on. Some of it hopefully you didn't know before, so that's a big part of what we're trying to do. And of course, I can only repeat the words of thanks for this morning's present. I sort of knew what they were going to say, and I was still absolutely knocked over by it. Stunning morning and hugely stimulating. So thank you very much to the four of you. So this afternoon we're going to look at unadventurously titled Later BRESSON. Quite a lot of BRESSON really. It's Mouchette, where two of the first presentations begin is fairly mid-period. But anyway, I suspect maybe that looking at the titles, the shift will be from the contextual to more looking at the films themselves.
Probably, yeah. In my case, at least. Yeah.
Yes. So there'll be a slight shift of focus, but that will be interesting. We might interrogate why there's more contextual work around the earlier movies and more text work around the later movies, perhaps. And we have presentations from Miguel Gaggiotti from University of Bristol, Steve Goff, and then online Ray Watkins from Penn State University, and Elise Durant, who's joining us from Los Angeles. I suspect rather early in the morning for her. I should say that Colin was up at I think 4 in the morning for his presentation. So the American online presenters are putting a hell of a shift in. So our first speaker this afternoon is Miguel Gaggiotti. His title is Adapting Gestures, Performance and Repetition in Mouchette. He's a filmmaker and lecturer in film and television at the University of Bristol. His research interests include screen performance and participatory filmmaking, in particular the performances of and creative collaboration with first-time non-professional actors in cinema. He's widely published on this subject and is now preparing a monograph on the topic for Palgrave Macmillan. And on that basis, I will hand over to him and welcome Miguel and have a great time.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you so much for organizing this beautiful conference. I haven't looked forward to a conference more than this one for a long time. So as a fan of BRESSON, I'm sort of super delighted to be here. So before I go on with the presentation itself, I just want to issue a quick trigger warning. I am going to be discussing and showing the sequence in Mouchette where the protagonist gets sexual attack. And I just wanted to mention that in advance, just so you know. All right, so different authors have all argued that Robert Bresson's Mouchette is a particularly rich and complex film when it comes to the protagonist's performance. For instance, in his 1969 essay on the film, Charles Barr points out that an essential part of the film's meaning is there irreducibly in Mouchette's face, body, and sensuous movements. The way she grinds and pours coffee, throws the lid of the pot dexterously back into place, caresses Arsène in his feet, sings to him, clasps him even as he rapes her, washes up glasses, warms the baby's milk against her breast, rolls downhill, rides a dodgem car at the fair. Barr not only highlights the relevance of specific gestures in the film, but by linking them together, he seems to be suggesting that the essential and irreducible meaning he speaks about might be found in the relationship between the gestures. If this were the case, attending to these relationships would be complicated further by the fact that Barr's list is not in consecutive order, thereby implying, however sadly, that Mouchette's performance in the film might operate by following a logic which is different and might even go against the chronological unfolding of the plot. More recently, in his essay, Mouchette and the Paradoxes of the Language of Images, Jacques Fancier arrives at a similar conclusion when he argues that whilst the film narration, through precise mise-en-scène and decoupage, pushes the plot forward with a sense of strictness and avoidability, Mouchette's on-screen performance creates a screen image logic that gives the surface of the shot the internal density and the power to bifurcate sequences. It is the power of a body constructing its own performance by setting itself at cross purposes with the film's ordering. So for Rancière, while editing and mise-en-scène create a form of narration that leaves sort of little room for interpretation, performance unlocks multiple meanings through its own logic. Now, I'm not gonna unpack Rancière's theory in this presentation, but what I'm interested is in exploring specific gestures in the film with a focus on how they might articulate meaning through their relationship to other gestures. In this regard, I believe that there's a sort of surprising disproportion between what these theories promise and the little attention that has been afforded to specific performance details in the film. This disproportion, I argue, asks that we look for concepts and modes of analysis that are sensitive to and can articulate more vividly the power and significance that these authors attribute to Mouchet's performance. So the first gesture which I would like to consider is that of Mouchet's singing, which takes place in two moments in the film, first at school and then later during Arsene's fit. So I'm going to play a clip which has both clips within it, one after the other one.
Trois jours lundi colons. Espérez plus d'espérance, trois jours lundi colons. Espérez plus d'espérance, trois jours lundi colons, en montrant le ciel immense, le fond de l'horizon. Trois jours et je vous donne un monde, à vous qui n'avez plus d'espoir, sur l'immensité profonde, tes yeux s'ouvraient pour me voir.
So this is an important example in Ranciere's discussion of the film. And as he rightly points out, in Bernano's original novel, Mouchet sings two different songs. She sings one of Madame's tunes at school, and she sings a Negro dance during Arsene's seizure. Bresson instead chose to have the protagonist sing the same song twice, with the most significant difference being that while Mouchet does not get the note right at school, she has no issues when singing for Arsène. We can clearly recognize in the second clip the bifurcation that Rancière discusses earlier. So on the one hand, the sequence propels the plot forward, allowing Arsène to recover from his fit, which in turn will lead to Mouchet's attack in both novel and the film, and then eventually to her suicide. And in that regard, we could speculate that, if the song she sings in the second clip was a different song like it is on the novel, that would likely happen in the same way. At the same time, the repetition of the song, the fact that it is the same song sung twice, results in a range of meanings. So firstly, it updates our understanding of Mouchet by revealing a skill or proficiency we thought that she didn't possess. The film is unclear as to why exactly Mouchet does not struggle singing the tune right the second time. So maybe the environment is less pressuring, or maybe she has internalized the song. But her success in the second clip also opens the possibility of her missing the note on purpose at school. So in that sense, repetition foregrounds iterability, which in turn undermines the primacy of the original. So in that sense, it's very interesting because although this can be read as a chronological transformation in the character, so the character learns to sing, it can also be seen or thought of as a changing of our understanding of the character. In that sense, Dominic's concept of redescription, which he's published recently about the notion of how films and characters within films redescribe information about them and update our information without necessarily changing, changing within the plot, is really useful to think about. However, secondly, and more importantly for my analysis, repetition here foregrounds the role of Mouchet as an adapter, as someone who changes something by means of repeating it. In this case, by repeating the song, not only does she change how it sounds or the context in which it is heard, she also changes the function of the gesture of singing itself. The first singing was primarily an expressive or demonstrative gesture, that is, its function at school seems to be to either express something through the song or most likely to attain or demonstrate singing proficiency. It's like an exercise or a test. However, the function of the second one, of the gesture in the second singing, is on the other hand primarily operative. She's trying to modify something in the material world, in this case, Arsene's health. So in other words, not only the context or features of the song change, but the function of the gesture of singing is different. Hence, what's at stake in this redeployment of the song is a passage between different uses and understandings of gesture and performance. These gestural adaptations are common throughout the film and extend beyond instances of evident repetition. That is, many transformative gestures Mouchette performs throughout the film rhyme with other gestures, even if they aren't copies. For example, Mouchette's repetitive glances and smiles are what transmute the bumper car ride into a game of flirting and seduction. Mouchette's grinding of the coffee, which is itself a sequence adapted from Vittorio De Sica's 1952 film Umberto D, transforms a dull routine into a game. And in that sense, there is also a sense of transformation through performance in the sequence in De Sica's film. So both gestures in both films are transformative. Mouchette's nursing of Arsène, for example, also parallels her nursing of the baby, and so on and so forth. So with this focus on Mouchette's gestural adaptation in mind, I would like now to consider another key moment in the film, which is the sequence in which Mouchette is raped by Arsène.
Ah. Ah. Ah.
Cutting the sequences shorter because they are longer in the film. I just didn't want to run too long over time. So Mouchette's gesture, her hands clasping Arsene's back, is also not present in the original novel and has been interpreted in different ways. In this way, I will just discuss a couple of readings with you. Firstly, Rancière offers this rather short account of the sequence. He writes, Mouchette's hands slip round Arsene's neck to express, in a rather familiar fashion, the passage from pain to pleasure. A different reading is offered by McNeil Taylor, who explains, as Arsène rapes Mouchette, her arms flail back and forth and she looks like a malfunctioning robot. Eventually, she seems to acquiesce to the situation and embraces Arsène. Again, her resignation comes from an understanding of the inexorability of this narrative world. She knows that it is of no consequence whether one resists or gives in. So, Rancière's account is not necessarily wrong, but feels surprisingly simplistic, considering the lucidity with which he theorizes Mouchette's gestural complexity in the film. Taylor's explanation, on the other hand, is coherent with Mouchette's mistreatment throughout the film, but feels unconvincing with regards to Mouchette's performance in this scene. If at this point Mouchette arrives at some form of realization of the unchangeability of the world, then why would she act upon it? Her flailing arms might have easily just fallen to either side and gone numb. Instead, she actively embraces Arsène, which seems a very demanding gesture to carry out as a mere display of resignation. Rancière's reading considers performance primarily as expression, that is, as non-verbal communication, and focuses on the individual. Taylor's reading of the action, on the other hand, focuses on the gesture as demonstrative. That is, in the second case, performance is regarded as the body's inevitable display of the endurance of being in the world. I would like to propose another interpretation by firstly reading Mouchet's grasp in relation to the idea of gestural adaptation that we've been discussing, and secondly, by considering Mouchet's gesture as operative rather than expressive or demonstrative. So as Rancière points out, the gesture, which is initially like a clasp and then a softer hug, indicates a passage. These two individual gestures, however, are performed recurrently throughout the film. Violent grasping is common in Madame or Mouchet's father's physical interaction with the protagonist. At the same time, the motherly caring embrace is a gesture Mouchet and her mother perform in the film, not naturally or passively, but actively, always involving a certain effort and with the objective of helping another. In going from one gesture to the other, Mouchet's clasp morphs into a caress, almost a pat on Arsene's back, which besides pleasure might also suggest compassion or pity. As when she's calming the crying baby, Mouchet's embrace partly constitutes an active gesture of care that responds to violence with non-violence. Judith Butler has recently referred to such actions not as passive or lacking force, but as gestures where victims, rather than going limp, absorb violence without replicating it. Elena del Rio also offers an account of performance that resonates with this reading. She explains that rather than thinking of performance as either the active expression of authentic interiority or the passive inscription of external oppression, we can consider performance as an ever-changing material event that registers the impact of social and cultural pressures on the body in an active and creative way. The idea that performance does something with those social pressures and conditions, as opposed to simply suffering them passively or reactively, is key here. Seen in this way, Mouchet's gesture need not necessarily display resignation or express a passage from pain to pleasure. Rather, it could constitute a body articulating its capacity to transform the world or its meanings through performance. That is, Mouchet's gesture might also make sense when seen at this level of performance as the action of someone who attempts to transform forces, literally to adapt them. The gesture is therefore not necessarily that of someone who, in the process of being raped, starts to feel pressure or simply gives up. Rather, it could also be the gesture of a body who firmly believes that they can transform a terrible situation into something else through performance, even if this transformation is ultimately unsuccessful. So the purpose of my analysis of the second gesture is not so much to show that the other readings are wrong. On the contrary, in focusing on either the individual or the world, these readings respond to a powerful clash which certainly exists in the film. That is, Mouchet is a film about a girl becoming more and more isolated and eventually committing suicide as she tries to deal with the horrible pressures of a hostile world. Rather than opposing this, with my reading, I have tried to interpret the gesture in relationship to other gestures of care performed in the film, thereby inscribing it within the generous affective logic of Mouchet's performing body. I have also tried to consider the gesture as operative rather than as expressive or demonstrative. That is, as an attempt at improving the world through performance, which is coherent with similar operative gestures carried out in the film. I have also explored how different understandings of performance might not only lead to different interpretations, but might be necessary to illuminate the complex ways in which individual gestures articulate meaning in the film. In this regard, I would argue that thinking about or sensing how gestures adapt their qualities, meanings, and functions through repetition is, in the case of Mouchet, not only a tool which can assist the analysis, but also something that the gestures themselves actively encourages us to do. Thank you very much.
Miguel, thank you. That was really interesting. As I said, a shift of focus from this morning's conversation. Thank you. Our next presenter is Steve Goff, who will talk about In the Footsteps of Mouchet. So we'll move perhaps from gesture and image to sound. Steve is a graduate of the National Film and Television School and a BAFTA-winning film director and writer, who's also worked in television, radio, and theatre, as well as publishing 2 novels. And I know this is late career as an actor as well. So, Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I must say, it's so exciting to be here. I hope everyone feels the same. It's fantastic. I'm not a devotee of, well, this is the first conference I've ever been to. I've been more of a filmmaker. I've done film teaching in my time, but more filmmaking, film writing. And it's so exciting to be amongst people and to see all the different ideas. And that last presentation is fascinating. And I think my approach to Mouchette might be an interesting complement to what you've just been saying. So thank you for that. I think I know what to do with this thing. I'm not quite sure. Let me just try it. See. There I go. Is which one do I press? I'm not a great. Oh, I see. Oh, yeah. now I understand. So, okay, I want to explore in this paper Robert Bresson's peculiar and idiosyncratic sound world as reflected in one of his most affecting films. I say that deliberately, affecting films. Mouchette, made at the height of his powers in 1967. I come to this subject as a filmmaker rather than an academic or a critic, and I'm not an expert on Bresson, though he has been a very important influence in my own work. This is where I get chucked out of the conference. I even reenacted a famous Bressonian moment in one of my films, which wasn't a very wise thing to do. It is in the film, and that's the pub quiz question, what film it's in. I would like to begin by citing a memorable encounter with the film's soundtrack, which I experienced as a young filmmaker in 1978. I was at the National Film School in my first year as a directing student, cutting a very simple scene involving a couple of actors whose actions and words I have now long forgotten. However, when I casually placed a piece of library music over the sync sound to see what might happen, the transformation was quite breathtaking to me. Of course, we all know what music can do to embellish or destroy a film. But looking back, what was key to the experience was not simply that the music added an emotional wash, but that it seemed to create a whole new way of experiencing what was going on. One moment I was there sitting next to the actors, casually listening to a conversation. The next moment I seemed to be hovering above them, godlike, experiencing the same event in a totally different way. That artless track of music seemed to be alchemically transforming the base metal of the film. And I'll come back to that idea later on. There we go. These don't do very much, by the way. Don't expect great things from these. It's just to give you something else to look at. And now to Bresson's midterm masterwork, Mouchette, the world of the tragic heroine and the work of those haunting sound patterns weaving around her in Bresson's darkly concentrated and utterly beautiful film. Bresson's use of sound has received critical attention over the years, not least because there's often very little dialogue in his storytelling, and so sound effects per se hold an important place in the drama. Indeed, spot effects, such as doors opening and closing, footsteps, traffic passing in the streets, sound atmospheres, such as wind or fire, music, used very sparingly but very precisely in his films, all come to perform charged roles, not simply adding to exposition or colouring character or situation, but weaving a powerful symbolic tapestry beneath the stark surface realism. Bresson's Catholicism is a key influence upon his films, and his religious preoccupations are not hard to find in the symbolic work of sound effects in Mouchette. We can think of the tolling of the church bell in the final heart-wrenching minutes of the film leading to our heroine's suicide. Or, more subtly actually, the sound of wine or liquor poured into glass after glass throughout the film, so suggestive of the sacrament of the Mass. However, Bresson's spiritual archetypes indeed go back even further than the Gospels. Take those thunderous lorries that roar past during moments of confusion and suffering. Bresson's Greek furies, whose abrasive snarls and growls call up forces determined to confound humankind's instinctive hopes and dreams. Let's pause for a moment to look at Mouchette's bleak story. Here is a young girl raised in poverty and enslavement by an alcoholic father, desperately trying to tend her sick, dying mother, pathetically trying to feed and clothe her baby brother, whilst the world around her at best ignores her, at worst intensifies her suffering by exploiting her innocence and vulnerability for its own selfish ends. Mouchette is very like the donkey in Balthazar, which was made, as we know, just a year earlier, both witnesses to an alienated and alienating world, and yet unable to speak or act. Yet Mouchette is not just a passive victim. At key moments, she asserts her instinctive courage and rebelliousness, and I think this links up with the previous talk. Not with defiant words, but with the sounds she makes, small, everyday noises which are both brave and iconoclastic, scraping her filthy clogs into a neighbour's carpet, sending a wet clod of mud flying through the air to hit the white blouse of a classmate that she hates. She uses her voice just once to express her defiance, singing out of tune to defy the will of her dictatorial teacher. Then, much later, as we've seen in the extract, singing the very same song, perfectly in tune, to the man she hopes for one brief moment might become her friend. That's the point of discussion, of course, from the previous paper. Thus, non-verbal symbolic sounds, charged intrusions into a largely voiceless world, and they are everywhere in Bresson, everywhere in this film. We can think of clinking bottles, of coins clashing onto a counter. We can think of dodgem cars colliding, or the sharp slap of a hand across a cheek. Every one of these effects has its meaning, its symbolic reverberation, and together they weave a very beautiful Bressonian choreography, a ballet, if you will, because it's ballet rather than opera we are talking about. It is time to talk about silence. I once directed a 30-minute thriller without a line of dialogue, and I don't recommend it. One of the people here was actually my assistant director at the time. Bresson is the master of silence, but not just the absence of dialogue and effects. I'm referring, this is really the center of what I'm talking about actually today. Not just the absence of dialogue and effects, I'm referring to complete and utter silence. Much has been said of Bresson as a minimalist filmmaker who drains all dramatic performance out of his model actors, leaving blank faces and mechanical movements through rooms and doorways. But with this silence, utterly dead silence, Bresson takes us to another level. Complete silence is very rare and unsettling in film, and it is routinely avoided. No film crew leaves a location without recording a buzz track, which the editor will later use to fill up the blank space. No silence, please. If you try to, I don't know if anyone has had this experience, if you try to upload a film onto YouTube today with a completely silent soundtrack, and I've done this, you will find that it has a reassuring atmospheric hiss when you listen to the completed upload, thanks to the platform's algorithms. And so in the world of mainstream film, and in our modern world, silence is definitely not golden. The YouTube actually adds the sound, because YouTube can't stand the silence. In Mouchette, there are long, eerie, and sometimes very unsettling sequences of more or less dead silence. And when a spot effect comes, like clattering footsteps or the slam of a door, the effect is to jolt you in your seat. One wonders if Ingmar Bergman was thinking of his beloved Bresson when he created his famous dream sequence in Wild Strawberries, using a bass track of utter silence, despite the fact that it was an exterior street, to produce an ineffable sensation of dread. I don't know whether you've seen that sequence, but it's quite amazing, and the silence is quite dreadful. Or perhaps Stanley Kubrick in 2001 was offering his own homage to Bresson when he followed the astronaut Dave into the blank silence of the cosmos outside his spaceship to repair a technical fault. Here, silence betokens agonizing vulnerability for the astronaut beyond the fragile boundary of the mothership's shell. Unlike Bergman and Kubrick, Bresson offers up dead silence in the midst of a seemingly everyday world. As Mouchette walks through the village towards her death in the last reel of the film, the path she takes is one of utter silence, except for the din of her clogs and the monotonous tolling of the church bell, redolent of her stark difference from the village community behind all those shuttered windows. She wanders into a curiously silent wood, its weird hollowness interrupted by odd foot rustles, then confronts the dreadful roar of hunters' gunshots. She witnesses the death of a rabbit, again almost completely silent. It is as if all her pain-filled life is now being poured into the tiny orifice, which is the faint scratching of the dying rabbit in its final convulsions on the grass. What happens when we experience such utter silence? time seems to stretch, become intangible. I'm talking about us as an audience now. Spaces become unreal. We seem to be part of a weird floating dream, except that Bresson is never merely psychological. And this is no character's hallucination. We're not in Hitchcock land. Hitchcock uses silence, but in much more of a direct psychological way. By the time Mouchette ends her life, rolling oh so quietly down the grassy slope to drown in the pool at the bottom, we seem to inhabit something like Kubrick's numbingly dead galactic space. The spell is broken by the harsh splash of water in the final frames of the film. A very small sound, but in the context of the dead silence, it now is like a thundercrack. And following on upon that is the Monteverdi Magnificat, which again is a great blast of music, ironic music, because of course it's Magnificat, but it is not magnificent what's happened. I have implied that sounds can affect our sense of space in a film sequence. I now want to focus for a moment more directly upon this aspect in the last part of my paper. In particular, I want to explore how, in Mouchette, Bresson's peculiar soundscaping profoundly influences how the audience is actually placed, physically positioned, as it were, within the fictional world. And I go back to that little story I told right at the beginning about my student film and the bit of library music that I added to it, because that moment showed how music could change the way I viewed a character. The same thing can happen in any film you might like to watch, but with Bresson, his very peculiar orchestration of sounds invites us into a very special place indeed. I don't know where I am with these slides, but I'll carry on. I know where I am now. They say that a good soundtrack makes you see a film better. It also, crucially, helps place you within the film's dynamic topography. When, in A Man Escape, we hear the persistent sound of scraping as the prisoner Fontaine tunnels his way to freedom with the aid of a spoon, we feel we are millimeters away, right next to that blind hunger for freedom. And when Joan sits in her cell in the trial of Joan of Arc, listening to the guard's footsteps passing up and down, again, it's as if we were millimeters away from her blank, tormented eyes. Note, I'm not talking about camera positions, but to that very special lens, which is the peculiar intimacy or distance that a sound effect can produce. And note that I'm not here referring just to the clarity and volume of an effect, but also to its ambient characteristic, its unique relationship with space. Place a microphone near or far away, it's not just the volume that changes, but also the pattern of frequencies. I'm sure we all realize this. That auditory signature, which can define very precisely where we are in the world. There is a curious moment in Mouchette, and I wonder if people will have noticed this, when the young girl's baby brother cries. It feels like a mistake. In fact, I think it is a mistake. I'm going to be chucked out of the conference again now because I'm saying that Bresson's making a mistake. I do think it's a mistake because in Bresson, almost all his dialogues, in this particular period of his filmmaking at any rate, are studio perfect. I'm not saying I'm not saying they're post-synced in a studio, but they are studio perfect, close up, unambient sound. No room reverberation, no muffled edges. And this is not so with the child's crying, the baby's crying. It was clearly recorded in a room, probably a meter or more away from the child. Bresson made the mistake of not having the time or the money to take the baby into a studio and wait for him to cry. So the baby sounds wrong. Of course, it would not sound so wrong, and this is the point of the story in a way. It would not sound so wrong if we had not got so used to the clear, precise, unambient sound of almost every other voice in the film. So here's the thing. There are many times in Bresson's film when the ambient signature of the sound effect does not quite match what we see. And these are not mistakes. They take us, in fact, to the heart of Bresson's creative eccentricity. The spot effect tells us that we're close. The camera tells us we are far away. The empty atmosphere track tells us we are in the dead silence of a very small room. The camera tells us we're in the street. Like some movie-making Escher, Bresson invites us to both feel close up and far away at the same time. Let me recap. Dead silence, unambient, dead voices, studio spot effects, also unambient, the occasional wash of an atmosphere. And I haven't talked much about atmospheres in this talk. I would if I had more time, because they're fascinating, his use of the Atmos effect. crowd hubbub, wind or fire or music. What happens to our sense of space within this peculiar auditory world? Distances and topography drift or warp giddily. We lose sense of any coherent physical space. We seem to hang like one of Kubrick's astronauts in limbo. Characters walk in and out of rooms, stride down streets, re-enter other houses, and their voices and the spatial atmospheres hardly change. Silence, spot effect, dead studio speech. One is tempted to describe this as dreamy, and in a sense it is, but as we noted earlier, Bresson invariably avoids the merely psychological. Think of how many times Mouchette cries in the film. You might think it's quite a lot of times, but in fact, we see tears on her face a number of times. We only actually see her cry twice. Bresson avoids the emotional wherever possible. And so with Bresson, we're not talking about a dream world, even if it might seem rather dreamlike from time to time. So what exactly is going on? We glide through spaces, we drift through doors and passages and pavements with that dance of post-sync effects, lorries, gunshots, feet. What does that remind you of? This is my personal response here. A labyrinth, a scurrying motion of a hamster turning in his exercise wheel, dead silence, unambient effects, undifferentiated space. Excuse me. Is the space we inhabit, therefore, finally not psychological, but existential? And those blank faces trooping this way and that are perhaps not so much individual human beings, but humanity itself, Shakespeare's bare-forked animals, as seen from above by the pitying or pitiless gods. So this, I'm right at the end now, this, I believe, is the final meaning of Bresson's eccentric soundscaping in Mouchette. A benighted, post-Lapsarian world, perceived by us, the audience, not as human beings. Remember, I was talking about the position we have in relation to the film. We're not human beings with other human beings. We're like gods, not necessarily judging gods, but gods. That's a whole other conversation. I have not talked about Bresson's later films, and just before closing this paper, I just want to mention, because Jonathan said, do mention other films from other parts of his career. So I'm obliging Jonathan now, but it's actually a very interesting question I hope I'm going to end with. L'Argent, Bresson's last completed film, which bears so many fascinating similarities with Mouchette, not least its richly choreographed medley of footsteps, slamming doors, pouring liquids, and roaring traffic. One thing, however, is missing: dead silence. If you watch L'Argent, there is no dead silence. The film actually deploys a conventional mix of interior and exterior sync sound atmospheres, just like many other mainstream films of the day, of the period animated. And as a result, we seem to be placed very firmly, like in those other mainstream films, in a coherent physical space. And yet L'Argent is just as strange and dreamy and stylized. And why? And I'm not going to answer the question. But I do think there is a key difference in L'Argent. But I think the actual structure of the story provides the strangeness, the existential quality in L'Argent, rather than this perspective that sound gives us. And with that, I'm hoping that I'm going to give you a short. I've talked a lot about that final sequence in the film, with the dead silence and the spot effects, and I'm hoping that this is what you will now see.
Je ne te veux que du bien. Toi, tu es mauvaise. C'est sûrement faute de comprendre. Tu as le mal dans tes yeux.
more time, I'd show you the whole sequence with the dead rabbit, but I'm afraid I don't have more time. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was absolutely fascinating. All sorts of things I hadn't thought about before, so it'd be fascinating to discuss that in due course. Do we have Ray? Excellent.
Hello.
Next speaker is Ray Watkins, who's going to talk about the shift to colour. So by necessity, we'll be moving forward a little bit in the world of Bresson. Hi, Ray. Nice to see you.
Hello.
Ray teaches English, Rhetoric and Humanities at Pennsylvania State University. His research focuses on post-war European cinema, and his first book, Late Bresson, and the Visual Arts, Cinema, Painting, and the Avant-Garde Experiment, makes an important contribution to the understanding and championing of Bresson's later films. So, Ray, it's a great privilege to welcome you here this afternoon, and over to you. What time of day is it for you? Hopefully those stars are not really outside.
It's now 9 o'clock.
Good morning, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for organizing and others who have been involved in organizing this event. As Colin said a few hours ago, it's very rare to have a conference devoted to Bresson, and it's a great honor to be part of it. So I was worried that I wouldn't have much connection to the two Mouchette papers, but I'm already finding a lot of links and interesting ways of connecting these papers. So let's get into the presentation. Okay. There is a well-established tendency in Robert Bresson's scholarship to praise the craftsmanship, innovation, and style of the black and white films, and at the same time, to view the color films as inferior, sloppy, and ill-conceived. The pervasive sense is that the richness and complexity of the black and white films are diluted, watered down, diminished in the color works. Many distinguished Bresson scholars such as Carlos Clarens, Paul Schrader, and Jonathan Rosenbaum insist that the black and white films are an experience of near religious transcendence, while the color films have less of a hold on the viewer. We need only look at the corpus of Bresson criticism to see to what extent this belief, which James Quant refers to as the problem of, quote, Bresson's descent, unquote, has taken hold, since most of the important critical Bresson studies focus on the black and white films. The shift toward acknowledging the color films began in 2011 with the appearance of a roundtable arranged by James Quant that included a thoughtful discussion of Bresson's use of color. That book was in his Robert Bresson Revised. At the same moment, Brian Price's book, Neither God Nor Master, Robert Bresson and Radical Politics appeared. At that point, the question of Bresson's important and singular approach to color began to be directly studied and explored, especially in an Anglo-American context. The argument I would like to make today is close to the opposite of this conventional view of Bresson. Namely, not only are his color films worthy of study, but in fact, they move toward greater experiment. In this way, Bresson gets much closer to the new form of cinematic expression that he calls le cinématographe. Bresson himself says as much in interviews. When asked by Michel Simon why he turned to color films so late, Bresson replies, quote, "It was too expensive. As soon as I could afford to, I was delighted to use color. Color is light. It is in itself light. All day long, my eyes paint. I watch shapes and form and color. Whatever people say, a painter has a ready-made drawing, at least the principal lines in black and white. Sometimes I need a bright color to set off duller shades," unquote. In this study, I offer 3 critical approaches that introduce some of the important ways Bresson uses color to develop and refine his aesthetic. The first is the way he draws on the visual arts. My examples come from the kinetic sculpture Lux 1, which Bresson uses to construct the museum sequence in Une Femme Douce, which I have. See if I can. See if I can get this slideshow to work. There we go. The second is his increasing preoccupation with reflections and luminescence, which takes on a heightened importance in the color films, reaching its apex in Quatre Nuits d'un Rêveur. And finally, I examine Bresson's increasingly thematic use of color in Lancelot du Lac and his last film, L'Argent. Much like the themes and counterpoint of a musical composition, Bresson increasingly contrasts one set of color values with another in these films. And as we will see in these examples, color is not the only aspect of Bresson's art that changes. With it comes a wide range of formal innovation involving sound, gesture, movement, and the interaction between model and surrounding space. Okay, so for this, I'm going to show a short clip from the visit in Une Femme Douce to the Musée National d'Art Moderne. Let's see if I can, I have to find it here.
Entre la peinture et ça, il y a tout de même une cassure. Non. Il m'arrivait d'être agacé, mais sans haine. Je ne la regardais pas comme une criminelle. Je lui avais entièrement pardonné.
Okay, so oops. So there's 4 points that I'd like to make about that sequence. The first is the mechanical machine sounds of the kinetic sculpture that last for the duration of the scene. And the sounds start out quite loud and then diminish in intensity as the scene progresses. The humming and droning sounds of city buses, floor polishers, bateau mouche, and other modern machines thus become an important element in the soundtrack of the color films. The way the scene starts, number 2, the way the scene starts with the perspective of someone who is inside the Lux 1 sculpture, absorbed by the colored lights and moving activity of the screen. Number 3, the way, these are just a few pictures of the sculpture that we see in that scene. The way the pawnbroker and his wife enter the scene and become part of the kinetic sculpture, the way the colored lights of the machine are reflected off their faces, and the way they're being located between the painting by Georges Mathieu in the background, which is, I have picture of it here, Les Capetièmes Partout. And here's a picture of Georges Mathieu in the process. He was known for his action paintings, and he would dress in medieval outfits and create his paintings in front of live audiences. And this is him creating another painting during that time. So we see the way that the models here are becoming implicated in these series of artworks, becoming part of the artworks themselves. And then finally, number 4, the psychological tension between the wife and husband through their interactions with the artwork. So the husband claims the kinetic art light machine has little in common with painting, while the wife disagrees. And the wife's perspective, I think, is much closer to Bresson, since we know that he saw himself as a filmmaker who brings the painterly to cinema. So Une Femme Douce's attention to color, light, sound, and movement might be viewed as an artistic machine that has many similarities to Chauffeur's Lux 1. Okay, the next innovation that I want to talk about is Bresson's use of illumination, glow, refraction, and indirect light. Primarily, this is a shot from Quatre Nuits d'un Rêveur, and the faces of Jacques and Marthe that I'll come back to this. Okay, so the use of illumination and artificial light is not used to the color films. As early as Les Dames de Bois de Boulogne, light from the fireplace flickers across Hélène's face as she plots to destroy Jean's life. And later, Seraphita uses a lantern to illuminate the priest's face in a dramatic night scene in Journal d'un curé de campagne. And in this scene, still that I've selected, we see the grain merchant in Au hasard Balthazar as he illuminates his house using an oil lamp when he's being visited by Marie. The theme of illumination is amplified and extensively explored in the color films. Bresson's preference is for brightly illuminated, glowing objects surrounded by darkness, such as the glow of a television set in Une Femme Douce, or the illuminated Pont Neuf sign in Quatre Nuits, which becomes the repeated meeting spot for the protagonist. But perhaps most significant in this film are the repeated long takes of the Bateau Mouche as they float down the Seine. In these scenes, in which our protagonists are just as captivated by these glowing boats as the audience, surrounding space is filled with artificial light. Another dramatic example comes at the end of the film, just after Jacques has been jilted by Marthe. He turns to look over his shoulder, and we are given a point of view shot of a half illuminated moon in a dark blue sky. The use of illumination in Lancelot du Lac, instead of the cold blue reflections in Quatre Nuits, we're instead given warm brown tones of the night's encampment. Bresson especially focuses on the machinations of Mordred in his tent as he plots the murder of Gauvin and Lancelot. The light is a diffuse brown glow that puts Mordred in silhouette and provides the outlines of medieval knights and workers inside the tents. Such strategies show the extent to which Bresson has elaborated a relatively contained strategy from the black and white films into a complex series of interconnected themes in color. The third innovation is the way Bresson uses specific color patterns to create a larger interwoven narrative based on the alteration of colors. So I have a quote from him, quote, "A film does not consist of images. It consists of the connections between images, and these connections give life. The same is true for color. In painting, a blue is a blue, but if you put it next to a yellow, it is no longer the same blue. Or next to a red and a yellow, it is even less the same yellow, the same blue, the same red." If we begin with Une Femme Douce, the first color film, the use of color is predominantly the same throughout the film. Yellow, gold, and beige tones, such as the ornate painted art frames, the bedposts and railings, the gold bullion and scale used by the pawnbroker, even the costumes. Other colors are occasionally used, such as the green thick curtains and matching trench coat of the gentlewoman, but hues of pale yellow, gold, and beige pervade the film. In contrast, color in Lancelot du Lac is more nuanced and shifts between a series of distinct color palettes. The most dominant is white or beige to depict empty and almost desert-like scenes of the encampment. The white and gray stone walls of the Queen's castle, the broad swaths of bleached tents, and in general, highly oversaturated day scenes. In contrast, the glowing illuminated night scenes seem like carefully arranged theatrical sets. The light is so concentrated and golden as if it emanates from inside the tents and seems more like a campfire than a lamp. Finally, Bresson shifts to sequences of the dense green foliage of the forest, often suggesting a disorienting, overwhelming, and even terrifying space for the knights who pass through this unknown and unknowable land. Bresson layers these three color schemes in ways that suggest that he is building a symphonic composition through color. His last film, L'Argent, provides an even more complex symphony of color schemes. When Yvonne is in prison, scenes with him in prison strongly emphasize navy blues and greens. Scenes in the photography store, in contrast, are predominantly off-white or beige. The hospital costumes and decor are white and blue, respectively. Scenes in court very strongly emphasize a walnut brown, punctuated by the vermilion robes of the judges. Finally, the widow's house in the climax of the film is largely green, reflecting the dense foliage around her house, and emphasized on the soundtrack by the loud sounds of a bubbling creek whenever someone crosses the bridge. I map out in greater detail the way some of these unified color motifs communicate with one another in my book project, but much more remains to be said, especially in the way these shifts are coded to specific ambient noises, as I just mentioned, the babbling creek, or the color green, or the sound of bagpipes in Lancelot, which are connected to specific color symbols. So the three tendencies I've outlined, the turn to the plastic arts, the use of strategies of illumination, and the contrasting use of color patterns, provide some indication of the complexity and richness of Bresson's late films. Perhaps in the future, we will therefore see Bresson as an innovator in his approach to color cinema in a way no filmmaker has traveled, and who made a number of black and white films as preparatory gestures toward these crowning final achievements. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. We'll move straight on so we get as much time as we can for some questions in due course. Our last speaker in this second section is Elise Durant. Elise is a screenwriter and film director, and will speak about greats in the films of Robert Bresson. Hi Elise, nice to see you. Elise's debut feature film, Eden, is a bilingual film inspired by her childhood experience in Mexico, starring the singer-songwriter Will Oldham. Eden has screened and won prizes at film festivals throughout the world, and I'm very pleased that we have Elise's permission to show the film this afternoon. If anyone would like to see it at either 3 o'clock or 4:45, do let me know, and we can ensure that you're accompanied over to the screening room. But before that, we will hear Elise's thoughts as a fine filmmaker on moments of grace in the films of Will Bresson.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can everyone hear me okay in the room? Wonderful. Thank you. Let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Here we go. Thank you so much for having me. It really is truly an honor to be here today. Bresson has played such an influential role in the way that I think about film and make films. And when I look more closely at what it is I love so much about Bresson, what stands out for me are these small moments in his films, and what I'm calling moments of grace. And when I refer to grace, I'm not referring to the religious idea of it as divine intervention, but rather it's something much simpler. Throughout his work, again and again, even for a fleeting moment, he can isolate his subjects from an often brutal day-to-day reality and strip the surroundings bare to focus on a hand or a face. These moments can be intimate, tender. The author, Gil Perez, in The Material Ghosts, his book, The Material Ghost, talks about, he defines tenderness, I think, in a very apt way as a concrete manifestation of unsuppressible beauty and humanity. And during our time together, I would like to explore examples of these moments.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
At the moment, we have you as a very small thumbnail on the top right hand of our screen.
Oh, that's fine. That's
I
fine.
don't know if that's intentional.
I like to be cloaked in black.
Well,
yes.
if you want to do otherwise, you may tweak something.
There we go.
Thank you.
And during our time together, I'd like to explore examples of these moments of what Bresson calls movements from exterior to interior. And so what is grace? I'm going to, more than anything, call out some of these moments for us. I'm not an academic, I'm a filmmaker. So grace often appears at night. Here we have Marie's feet padding in the night in Au hasard Balthazar. She is in her nightgown and she picks a flower, a wildflower, and crowns Balthazar with it. There's a similar scene in Four Nights of a Dreamer where Marie is in the quiet of her room at night and she puts a radio on and she sways to the music and she looks at herself in the mirror, takes off her nightgown and looks at her wrists and her ankles. These two very similar, these similar scenes, I'm getting a little lost, sorry everybody, are incredibly intimate. Again, very tender, almost a fragile, delicate beauty. And I think that what nighttime can offer us is a space apart from the day-to-day impersonal, colder world and duties that we have to interact with and present in the world. And these moments almost set up, they're just very different. I would say dreamlike, but they're not. They're just isolated in their own space. And there's something similar to me about entering the space of a movie theater and being cloaked with a similar darkness, and a film and the camera eye allowing us the privilege of being present in the more intimate spaces of another human being's existence. We'll move forward to often also grace can appear in a hand or a gesture. Let's see here. It's the blessing that our priest in Diary of a Country Priest gives a mother sick with grief after the son of her death. And it can appear in the wiping away of a tear between two lovers and the devil probably. And there's also a glimmer of a moment of grace regained in L'Argent after Yvonne's wife and child are no longer with him, when he picks hazelnuts from a tree and he shares them with the woman who takes him in. Grace can often be a face. It is the quiet contemplation we are given when the camera rests on Fontaine's face in A Man Escaped. I love how Bresson places the figure in center frame and strips the background bare so that we can focus on the breathing life of a human being held before us. And these images remind me sometimes his treatment of faces and central characters. They remind me of religious iconography. So if I can share a little bit of personal experience, I was raised in Mexico and my father was an art and artifacts dealer. And he would bring these devotional paintings of saints into our home. He himself was not religious, so they were appreciated for the often untrained hand that had painted them. And they were these small devotional pieces. And they were often flat. The figure, usually cloaked in black, would be placed in the center of the frame, and the backgrounds were bare to draw attention to the figure. And oftentimes the face seemed illuminated. What's interesting, looking into iconography, I noticed, I learned that usually these religious items don't depict the saints as they were as human beings, but in life, but as they are supposed to be in eternity. So they abstract natural phenomena and they were used for prolonged contemplation. And I think that for me, having these images, when I saw Bresson's work, there was a language, a visual language there that I immediately recognized and was familiar to me. Oftentimes, there's the downcast eyes. Again, we have our priest here, cloaked in black with his downcast eyes. And then grace comes with death, I've noticed. And in A Gentlewoman, grace seems to be death. It is the praying, the washing of the body, the sitting with the body. It's the husband sits by the body's side, and he speaks and recounts his relationship with his wife, and it's almost as if there's a peace there, sitting with the body, as if there's a communion possible with her in death that they had never had in life. And if I can allow myself to be so bold, I'd like to share some images from my film Eden, which is Jonathan mentioned is screening today, and this was shot on location in my hometown in Mexico, and the way that I treated the image oftentimes was to the figures were always center screen. And there's very, I would allow them to the camera to be focused on them with a very minimal background. And um, this here is one of my favorite scenes. It's a very small scene within the context of the film. There is no dialogue. This is the film is about a woman who goes back as an adult to revisit the past and understand who her father was, who is no longer alive. And this is the father who is sleeping, but he looks, this is the first shot in the scene, and this is the perspective of the young girl seeing her father, and it foreshadows his death. And she ruffles his mustache to make sure that he is breathing. And once she hears the breathing, she can then fall into the crook of his protective body while he is still alive. And then there's this shot here of their feet from her point of view, and something that I love and that I often appreciate so much is the image of feet and hands. Also, just to backtrack for a second, there's something that I also love to do when I place a camera before the actors is let them sit in very uncomfortable long silences, and which is something that the camera sustained on a face that I love so much about Bresson. But what I love to do with that is I don't think the actors love it, but I think that something really beautiful begins to happen. There's an interplay, especially when the camera is incredibly solidly still and there's barely any movement, and we can begin to hear the breath, and the actor's body relaxes. And I find that always these interesting things begin to happen, and that there's an intimacy there that you wouldn't otherwise find or attain. And then finally, I love hands and feet, and this is a shot of the main character tactilely finding her way through the past as she goes and sorts through physically objects from her past. And here she is cutting some flowers in honor of the dead. Thank you.
Elise, thank you. That was fascinating. It's a very personal, very beautiful film. It was generous of you to share so openly the influence of Bresson and what lies behind your film. Thank you. It's a wonderful movie. Elise's film will be on at 3 and 4:40. If you'd like to see it, please let me know. We'll arrange for you to accompany over to the screening theatre. Harrison, I might pick on you and ask you if you can set the film up for me. And I realise I'm probably not going to have time to do it myself. We're obviously running a little late, so what I propose is check it out. Is that we will have a Q&A now until 3 o'clock. We'll then take a break till 3:10, and then we'll resume then. So Stephen, whether you'd like to come up, and Elise and Ray, hopefully we have you. Elise and Ray, hopefully we have you on screen. I've had the great good fortune over the years to spend a lot of time with Steve, Elise, and online remotely at least with Ray. So I've had a chance to quiz them many times. So rather than me dominating these questions, I'd much rather if others wanted to start. I'm very happy to. Lovely, fantastic.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much for such amazingly rich papers. This is really a question for Miguel, actually. The first thing is just, I don't know if you've read Jordan Schoenig's book that came out last year. I think it's called The Shape of Motion. But he has a section analysing gesture in Mouchette, so that might be interesting to. I love this thing about whether she sings the note wrong I find on purpose. Every time I think about it, I change my mind, even between you. Anyway, that's not my question. So obviously these are two sequences that you showed have to do with coercion, obviously. And what your sort of paper made me think, you might think that one can sort of resist being coerced, or you can accept. But I think you're suggesting that doesn't exhaust the possibilities. You're talking about a sort of operative gesture that does something kind of proactive, or maybe refusal is different from resistance. So I'm thinking about the sort of the sociality of the scenes, and my interest is just specifically the thing that you didn't really talk about, which is the fact that she refuses to sing with everybody else. And so just sort of how that, there's a scene everybody's singing, she doesn't, then she's forced to sing on her own, and then she chooses to sing again later, but not on her own. I don't know. I just wondered how that feeds into your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. She does sing with some. She after the Madame forces her, she pushes her onto the crowd, and then she sings one last time with the crowd and does it wrongly again, right? And then you get this shot of this close-up of her crying, and that close-up of her crying is the one that makes me think that goes against the reading, I think, of her singing intentionally wrong at school. However, I think that the possibility of her singing intentionally wrong at school is somewhere in the novel, because she doesn't cry after singing after Madame's humiliation. She doesn't cry, I think, in the novel, or I think she puts a face which suggests something other. So I think that possibility is kind of latent in the novel, which I think is quite interesting. With regards to the crowd and solitude, I think that's quite interesting, and I also think that also kind of speaks a little bit about the something which I didn't have the time to talk about here, but I think is also in my mind, which is that idea of choice, and the idea of having a choice and having a possibility to actually intervene, and not going with the crowds and not being carried by the group. And I think that kind of that it's interesting because a lot of other characters do also repeat actions, so she's not the only one who repeats. So it's not that her creativity comes from repetition, it's from a certain way of using repetition, right? I don't know if I have anything else to say about this sort of group, but I think that's super interesting. Absolutely.
Steve, have you dealt with the film? Do you want to add anything to that?
The only thing that's going through my mind listening to the conversation is it's just another topic actually, really, but just to sort of throw it out, is which I noticed, studying the film for science, is the private and public spaces in the film, which I think is what you're sort of alluding to, because obviously the rape and that long sequence in the hut is intensely, although it's with another person, it's intensely private. And the wood, of course, is a private place. And when she walks across this road into the wood, she does it more than once. She's going from the public world of the village and the school and the pupils to this private world. So there's that whole dichotomy of private and public, which is really fascinating.
David, you have a question?
Thanks, Jonathan. First of all, I should say this is a follow-on question to Miguel, so I want to apologise immediately to the other panellists and say that I thought all four presentations were both revelatory and very beautiful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Miguel, just so you know who you're up against, I'm just a retired old person, but I was the film censor for the UK for 12 years, so I've obviously got quite a bit of experience of depictions of sexual violence, quite possibly more than anybody else in the United Kingdom. But, so I just wanted to say that I know you were being very subtle, and you were not inviting us to say that you were right and Rancière and the other Taylor were wrong, but you were bloody well right, and Rancière and Taylor were wrong. I mean, just to try and put it in my own natural language, I think what we saw was a gesture which initially was one of shocked and then restrained but intense distress, which gradually turned into a gesture of care. And I think that's incredibly unusual, actually. I'm not sure I can think of a single example of all the number of times I was looking at scenes like that where that's what I saw. So I think you gave a very beautiful and convincing explanation of it. It will also, I think, be a very nice lead into Robert Pippin's session after tea, because care, of course, is also a Heideggerian concept, and I think that may be one of the things he's going to talk about, Jonathan. So that's me.
Thank you. Just to ensure we have balance, I'm going to ask the next question, just in case everyone keeps it coming, two people in the room. Ray and Elise, we spoke this morning quite a lot about collaboration and particularly with cinematographers. We talked about Agostini this morning. Obviously, Bresson worked with Pasqualino de Santis on his final 3 films. Ray, you didn't talk about Le Diable Probablement, so I wanted to really ask you about issues of collaboration with cinematographers and elsewhere, particularly when they're as challenging as I think the relationship between de Santis and Bresson was, although they kept coming back to it. So maybe, Ray, first, you might like to talk a little bit about Bresson, de Santis, and Elise, you might like to talk about how you collaborate in the context of such subtle imagery and views.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the person that I have written about is Pierre Charbonnier, who was the set designer for a number of Bresson's films, and that's actually something I'd like to look into even more. But I haven't specifically looked at the cinematographer for each color film and how that may have changed the color compositions and the organization of the film from. So that's actually, you're actually giving me another good angle for how I could start to think about the differences between films.
Okay, thanks. Elise, would you like to comment on that particular and crucial but complex relationship between director and cinematographer?
Yeah, I can't pretend to know anything about Bresson's relationship with his cinematographers, but I for my own film with Eden, of course, it took a long time to find someone that seemed right for it, because I come from a still photography background, and Vicente Pozo, who is the cinematographer, also comes from a still photography background. And so I think that for me, that was a wonderful relationship, and we saw eye to eye on ideas of minimal movement and focusing on the figure, the central figure in each scene.
Okay, great, thank you both. There's a question at the back, and then 1, 2, 3. See how we go with time.
I have a question for Miguel about the repetition. I never thought about what you said. It's very interesting, the transformative effect. But I was just made me think about like Lancelot of the Lake. There's also many repetitions in that film, and there's a very strange at the end where there are many actions are repeated continuously after one. So they put the saddle on, they put the helmet on. It's just repeated 4, 5, 6 times. Have you thought? Because I was like perplexed by that when I remember when I watched it several times. I just couldn't. What was Bresson was trying to get at? Have you thought about that? I was just wondering, like, what was he trying to achieve there, or?
No, I haven't thought about it like in detail, but thank you so much for bringing it to my attention. Yeah, I think I mean obviously repetition is a key aspect of Bresson, both in terms of the films and the style, but also in terms of the methods that he used, right, with the models or the method that he presumably used when directing actors, right, to the point that I think it's in either in the John Phil book, the book by Anne Wiesemski, about sort of early process of being cast for Hazar Baltasar. I think she talks about how the tests that Bresson did with her were asked her to play to recite lines from Angels of Sin, from his first film. So there was an element of repetition, of strange repetition, where he was getting actors for later films to play roles he had already, had already been played in earlier films. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of interesting ways of thinking about repetition, I think.
Steve, you want to add something briefly?
It was interesting because one of the things I didn't have time to deal with in the paper was repetition of sound, and there's a whole area of repetition of sound. And one of the things that I was thinking of as I was prepared, I was originally going to put it in, but then I pulled it out, was in relation to Catholicism. I used to be a Catholic, I'm a lapsed Catholic, and the great thing about the Mass is that it's always the same, and it's repeated in the sound of the bell and the various prayers that occur. And I just wonder, I just throw it out as a question, whether Bresson, in terms of his Catholic upbringing and his Catholic preoccupations, the idea of ritual repetition is like in his blood, and repetition has a sacral quality for him, because certainly in L'Argent, the coins and the checks and the money is repeated and repeated and repeated.
Let's move on to another question. I think. Who's next? 1, 2. I can't remember what I counted. Let's try and keep them sort of short and specific, as we've only got another 10 minutes. I'd like to get around a couple.
I'm trying to make it short. Russia, Hazard, and Darwin, country priests, they all seem to be people in the relation to other people in the world, but normally good standing. Hazard seems to be more his relation to Dostoevsky's the idiot. He's not an idiot. He's got all his wits about him. It's just that it's easy to be an idiot because he behaves exactly as a human being should behave. So I was just wondering, what is Bresson's moral intention behind this? What is he expecting us to take from it, and to interpret it and act in our own lives? And just cheeky to get in a question on the colour, he actually said that he refused to use colour for a long time in fear of postcardism, because he wanted to achieve that purity that he was talking about in his cinematograph. So what philosophical change on his films brought about this throwing away of that postcardism critique and moving on to color?
Shall I answer that? I think Bresson would say he didn't have an intention about what your response would be. Your response is yours. There's a provocation there, and I think he would want to be considered a filmmaker who didn't seek to invert a particular. On the use of colour film, I think Ray's right. It's largely an economic consideration where you may have had the opportunity to do it earlier, but colour film wasn't a level he wanted. But certainly as soon as he was able,
I was just saying because he said it was postcardism.
Well, postcardism, I think, for him is gratuitously beautiful shots, and I think that's not his work.
Wait, what?
I don't think it is in those films. I think they're useful. But we can talk about that more. But let's try and get a couple more. Sally, and then hopefully one of them just back. Just the microphone off there. It's a lovely crop. You all look great.
Everyone's presentations were so fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Just quickly on the note of repetition, it makes me think, again, trying to think of Bresson, not just as a filmmaker, but as an artist. linking him to the minimalist artists in the 1960s whose work is all based on repetition. Robert Morris, Donald Judd, for example. But then I have a quick question for Ray. It was great to hear you talk about the Mathieu painting today. And I wondered in the shot that you showed us of Dominique Sanda nude, in the background, there's the television. Do you have, what was on the television, or is it all snow? And in the background, there appears to be a Baroque painting, biblical, mythological, where there also appear naked bodies. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that shot, actually, I have about 5 pages on in the book, because I think it's really an important scene in terms of defining Bresson's relationship to painting. The way that he uses light in that shot to frame the Baroque painting, he actually uses a rectangle of light that's the same size and shape as the television screen. So I think that shot is all about framing and about different kinds of artifacts and the way that he's framing them for the camera. So there's a lot. I think that you're right to pick up that I think there's a lot going on in that scene. And the painting, it is a television show. It's of a car race. And you can see the cars going around the track during and there's another television scene that happens with the pawnbroker sitting by himself later in the film. And that's a scene of, I think, World War II planes dropping bombs. I'm forgetting it a little bit now, what exactly is happening in that scene. And the painting is of Venus and Cupid in the Baroque painting. I haven't been able to identify the person who exactly painted it, but I've gotten close. So.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, then we're going to have a break till 3:10, and we'll kick off again. If anyone would like to go into the Arthur Lewis building to see Elise's film, please come and grab me, and I'll make sure you're accompanied over there. So final question, I think, from the back before we take a break.
Hi, thanks everyone. Question primarily for Stephen. You talk about mistakes in Mouchette, and you also link it with La Gente. Something that I think connects both films is that the last shot in both films is very uncanny, and probably the most uncanny shots in his whole filmography. The end of La Gente, the whole crowd is staring into an empty void, and the end of Mouchette, there's a running shot of the ripples of water after Mouchette sort of falls into it, that plays backwards and forwards like a GIF. But I think audience at the time wouldn't have been familiar with that. I suppose my question is just, I always had the question whether that was intentional or just a product of necessity on his part and wanting to fit the end of the sequence to the Monteverde and didn't have enough footage. I was wondering about your opinion on that.
I'm sure that's the case. I have to say, I'm sure. But I mean, that's part of filmmaking, and you can think of 1,000 cases where, there's I think it was some very famous filmmaker. It might have been Nick Roeg, or I think it was Nick Roeg actually, who said that when he arrived on the set and he didn't have any idea what he was going to do, he'd asked them to change the lens of the camera. That was his way of sort of engage. So it's like, the accidental things and things of necessity things, I think always play a part. It's part of the game, really. And I'm sure he was, yeah. But I think the baby was a mistake.
Thank you.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for presenting.